ligado o streaming? Se sim, piscar luzes uma vez. Oh, it is. It's on. Ok, então, gente, obrigado pela presença, seja à distância ou aqui mais próximo. Conforme eu avisei por e-mail aos alunos matriculados e também aos colegas, hoje a gente vai ter, então, a última atividade com o Peter, que seria na quarta-feira, mas em função das decisões da universidade de restringir os contatos e as atividades presenciais, nós estamos, então, fazendo desse o nosso último encontro. Por isso, sim, o Peter, muito gentilmente, vai tratar com a gente do tema Human Rights and Digital Media e também, na segunda parte da aula, vai trabalhar o tema que seria conversado hoje na palestra de abertura da Semana da Imagem, The Error at the End of the Internet. E a Semana da Imagem também foi adiada para a data ser combinada junto com o vírus, para ver quando é que ele vai embora. Não temos essa certeza ainda de quando é que termina essa bolsa do vírus aqui no Brasil. Por isso, eu vou passar para o Peter. Thank you once again, and let's go on with the class.
Thank you very much. And both a special thanks for those of you who are here, and a special hello for those who are watching this somewhere else today or later. I'm going to give a short version of the class that we had planned on human rights and digital media, which already came up in previous classes. There were already questions about access rights, information rights, and different ideological points of view, both on how we look at the difference between analog and digital media, and how we look at human rights under the conditions of analog media or digital media. So, in order to make time for a second talk to record here in this room today, well, we still have a room rather than just the internet, I will go pretty quickly through the first half of the slides here. So forgive me if that goes very fast, so that we can have more time for the second half of the slides, and then take a break in a little bit more than an hour. And he's going to improve the way that resolves on the screen, I'm sure. Thank you. So, on the one hand, these two topics seem to be very closely related. Human rights seem to be very much reliant on media, because human rights are something that has to do with witnessing, with testimony, with holding people to account, with first-hand reporting that can be shared, grassroots style. So the question is whether that still works the same way or not. And the second question is how we see a change, perhaps, in the discourse around human rights, also under the influence of a transition increasingly to networked and social media. So as I said, first quick part where I go over how we study media and what people in media studies think are some of the salient differences between earlier media and newer technical media, and then look at how we understand human rights under those auspices. Classical media theories have distinguished, and this is very crude in some ways, between a pre-alphabetic human world, an alphabetic period, and a post-alphabetic world. And you'll get this type of division from a lot of the pioneers of media studies, like here in Brazil, Willem Flusser, but in Canada, you get it from Marshall McLuhan, In Europe, you get it from various thinkers. So as of the 1960s and 70s, this sort of division of different eras of human communication has certain consequences for media theory. Pre-alphabetic humanities in the pre-alphabetic code tend to have circular forms, mythical forms, forms that have to do with the calendar of seasons of harvest. The medium tends to be symbolic representation. The important technology is one of interpretation. The basic gesture is imagination. The society tends to be a magic or a religious culture. Remember, this is a very crude after the fact theorization. The difference that is made by the alphabetization, by the introduction of reading and writing as a skill that is not just shared by a priesthood or an elite, but by the vast majority of people, is that increasingly our forms tend to be linear, logical. The medium is linear processing, not just symbolic processing of images. The technology is reading and writing. The basic gesture is storytelling, is narrative. A narrative that has a beginning and an end isn't as circular as myth or magic things are. And the society becomes an industrial society because there are many other technical tools that go along with literacy. And then both Flusser and McLuhan and other media thinkers have stipulated that there is a post-alphabetic society under the auspices of computing and of media connecting us in a different form that they sometimes describe as fractal or as recursive. The medium here isn't so much processing in a linear way, but integration of all of these recursive circles and cycles of media and the feedback. There's some cybernetic thinking that goes in here. The technology is specifically computers, and computers are very good at recursive iterations. The basic gesture is much more about information. It's not a storytelling culture anymore. And the society transitions from an industrial society to a knowledge economy. So the cybernetic thinking that I mentioned very quickly, and I'm going to pass over this too quickly today, is informed by Claude Shannon and by the Macy conferences and by Norbert Wiener and other thinkers who are transferring systemic and systematic models that they see at work in biological or other systems to communication systems. And one thing that I want to focus on, that I always have been focusing on when I show this kind of diagram, is the role of the noise source, which Shannon says is an endemic property of all channels. So in this case, I'm using a microphone, and if I misuse the microphone technology, there can be an introduction of noise, of feedback. If I were the Jimi Hendrix of lecturing, I could use that for good effect. So any kind of endemic, accidental or intentional use of the channel can play with the noise source and can use that. And so it's not a strict distinction, as McLuhan makes, between signal and noise. Right? Signal is the intentional, and noise is the unintentional message, etc. But for cybernetics, they're in recursive and feedback cycles. And we see the same thing developed in parallel, and we think maybe even in the same city, maybe even in the same hotel, but without a lot of social contact, in cultural theory by thinkers like Roman Jakobson, who is talking about aesthetic communication, literary, poetic, aesthetic communication, which might have different functions depending on where you look in the diagram. The addresser, the sender of a message, has an emotive function. The referential, the contextual function can go from I am speaking English and you understand that I'm speaking English. I need a translator to switch channels. There can also be just a phatic noise that I'm making. Part of it is, what I'm just doing here, gestures. I'm trying to minimize the number of, minimize the number of times that I say, like, etc. But we recognize all of these as part of human speech, as part of communication, in a phatic sense, meaning, I am signaling basically only that this channel is open, that I intend to send something. There are poetic functions in communication, and there are metalingual functions, and all of them seem to be addressing themselves in the conative function. So it's very parallel to the cybernetic understanding, although for engineers, of course, the only thing that matters is that you get a message through, whereas in cultural analysis, it's much more subtle. It's not just about a message getting to the addressee, but what and how is getting through. So if the classical media theories emphasize these pragmatic functions, you can break them down. You see the sender is associated with the expressive function, and the message is an individual utterance. The receiver is intended to be persuaded or influenced by this. The semantic function is a referential one. This message informs you about some reality. The code function can be the meta function, just, I'm speaking English, or I'm speaking academic English, or I'm talking about communication and media, whatever the contextual framing that I want to signal is. I talked about the phatic function. The message is just to maintain communication. And the aesthetic function is when you have a message that reflects on itself, that is aware of its own status. So this is all still the classical media theories, but more recently, media theories have kind of abandoned that traditional classical function and emphasize more processes. And there are three processes that seem to come to the fore. There's selection or abstraction or reflection as a reduction of the complexity of all of the noise of the internet, of digital culture around us. Selection is necessary to allow responses, continuation. If this were a good class and not a rushed online version of a class, we would have quite a lot of that. You would select the moment to interrupt me, to ask for clarification. I would select somebody who raises their hand. We would try to iterate on certain things and have a dialogue, or else communication is just a one-way thing, which is not really communication. Abstraction is whenever, instead of asserting validity claims, we try to zoom out. We try to communicate more conceptually or maybe speculatively. And reflection is whenever somebody has a cognitive operation to offer that negates or qualifies or refines a statement that somebody else might have made. So you could, and this is a speculative scheme from some colleagues of mine in Weimar who are looking a lot at recent media theories. You could sort recent media theories in that way. Some are saying the world is disorderly, it's entropic, therefore our reaction is to reduce difference. We worry most about a lack of consensus, right? And a Habermasian kind of ideal communication still relies on writing, the printing press, but also the computer to work through that lack of consensus. Whereas other theories, Baudrillard, maybe a Derrida might say the world is not so much disorderly, but it's complex to a point of being incomprehensible. So our reaction to that isn't to reduce difference, but to celebrate, to increase difference, to see that, that our biggest worry is a lack of dissent, not a lack of consensus. And what we want to emphasize are different strategic tendencies. And finally, there might be some media theories, such as Boris Groys's take on media, that says, what's important and interesting about the world is more invisible, more concealed. We're going to count on dialectics to help dissolve differences. Our biggest worry is not a lack of consensus or a lack of dissent, but a lack of inconsistencies. And there's a different technical approach associated with that as well. Why am I going through that when I'm supposed to be talking about human rights? Because I want to get to the point where we understand that I'm going to argue that it really makes a difference whether we are talking about photojournalists and print journalists emphasizing a human rights case, a humanitarian case, or whether we're dealing with social media and digital culture instead. So if media are ways to perceive and organize and then represent our world to others, all of these different focus points make a difference. Now in media studies, we can emphasize either the theory or the history or the aesthetics of media, and we can look more at cultural levels, more at technical levels, or more at social aspects. My own appetites might be different from those of other people, and as you know, people come to media studies from different disciplinary backgrounds. Some are much more theoretical, philosophical, ethnographic, psychoanalytical. Some are much more historical. Some are much more interested in the aesthetics of the different forms of media. If I have an explicitly social focus, I'm more likely to engage in policy or law or gender aspects of media culture in terms of the theoretical ones, or in terms of the historical forms, I might be more worried about the public sphere, who is the Habermas of the digital age. If I have an aesthetic focus, I might be focusing on different genres under the conditions of different media. With a technical focus, again, you could say the theories could be cybernetics or media archaeology or actor network theory. With a historical emphasis, you can see people working on platform studies or media economics. With an aesthetic focus in the technical layer, you can see people working on interactivity, production, reception. And with the fuzzily defined cultural focus, you can see people, again, distinguishing their approaches to media in various ways. So when we look at human rights, all of this makes a difference because you're not going to find very easily somebody who is explicitly against the principles of human rights. But it is curious that there is a complete lack of international agreement about where the emphasis should be placed in their promotion and their protection. Just a quick reminder, Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly of the newly founded United Nations as a cornerstone of the post-World War II internationalism, the attempt to create some kind of global consensus on December 10th, 1948, calling on all nations, quote, to cause it to be disseminated, displayed, read, and expounded in schools and in other educational institutions without distinction based on the political status of countries or territories. Right? So already it's not just a declaration of rights, it's a declaration that calls upon what media do: disseminate, display, expound, share, without distinction based on any kind of political context or national borders. So any failure to protect these rights is also a failure of media, of dissemination, of publicity, of display, and of education. So you could say, in a simple way, no human rights, no media, no media, no human rights. They seem to be intricately linked with each other. And instead of a lot of quotes or reading assignments for a class, I can just recommend some of the websites that will be a good guide to what the human rights debate looks like. There's a research guide on the UN website. There are a couple of academic institutions like Harvard, Bard College, University of Minnesota in the United States that I know of that do a good job accumulating references. There may be similar institutions in Portuguese. And then under certain organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International that are understanding themselves to be international watchdogs engaging in the propagation and defense of human rights. And it used to be that we think that those organizations, they might be multinational, but they don't have the power of a national or international executive. They basically, all they can do is mobilize shame. Right? They can point at things, they can point out atrocities and try to shame a corporation that has caused damage to a community or to the environment. They can try to shame an army or a militia that has broken the implicit or explicit rules of humanitarian conduct. So the unstated axiom of the human rights movement is that those who we want to affect, governments, armies, militias, business people, corporate spokespeople, politicians, parties, are exposed to the force of public opinion. So they're vulnerable to looking like they're dishonored or embarrassed or disgraced. So this kind of mobilization of shame is a force brought on by knowledge of guilt or impropriety, having done something that injures one's reputation. Now, arguably, we now deal with some politicians, some corporations that act as if they don't even know what shame is. But originally, if you think about what the concept of shame means, which goes back to biblical context, it's something reserved for those who are not guided by a conscience or the capacity to feel guilt. Right? So the moral person has that capacity and is going to feel guilty, have a guilty conscience. But whenever we find people who are acting without that, acting in an immoral manner, we try to mobilize shame as a social pressure on them. So publicity and exposure are at the heart of the concept of shame, applicable whenever there's not an enforceable law. You can't slap them, fine them, but you can expose, right? So you need to mobilize photographic or video or audio evidence of a transgression. So if mass violations like that become known through oral or written testimony, through visual proof, then the world can react. In the age of photography, whether it was amateur or professional, mobilizing shame really helped to defend human rights. Arguably, a lot of TV news services have really abandoned that. Even the embedding of journalists with military units has prevented that from looking as independently as it was before. And on the internet, the question really is whether this still works at all. Human rights organizations tend to be both intergovernmental and governmental, but also non-governmental organizations. And they often use public media to mobilize public opinion, to mobilize shame. But the more human rights around the globe have become law, both in governmental and in international structures, the more they look to enforcement through conventional structures. Right? We're going to censor this particular militia or a country, we're going to put sanctions on them, etc., instead of just the mobilization of media or the mobilization of shame. Meanwhile, the media industries, all of the commercial implementations of visual and audiovisual reporting have become increasingly dependent on the internet, on popularity, on advertising, on marketing. So they no longer function as a traditional public sphere. Some of them are just looking for outrage all the time. And some of them are trying to avoid to outrage you because they depend on you to stay on their page for longer so they can sell more advertising. So it's true, I'm sure that Amnesty International still sees the power deriving from mobilizing grassroots people to speak out, that Human Rights Watch and other NGOs still engage in human rights work by looking to an international audience to express outrage about local transgression and mobilize shame. But arguably, especially now that social media has become by far the dominant segment of people engaging with one another online, they're less and less conducive to the kind of Enlightenment idea of a Habermasian public sphere where governments, militias, corporations can be held accountable. Because arguably, now governments and corporations effectively control the mood in social media in particular, and in many segments of the internet in general, and any kind of critique or complaint tends to be minimized, suppressed, censored by the local internet filters, and it's much more difficult to get out of that context and to reach an international audience of well-intended witnesses. Also, the flip side of that is the kind of the dark side of revelation. It's overexposure. If you are looking for transgressions against humanitarian ideals, you can find something every minute of every day. And so the internet makes that a lot easier, it makes it more readily available. Instead of getting a dose in the evening news or in a daily newspaper, you can get something all the time. And some people may succumb to compassion fatigue, or they may even say, this is voyeuristic, this is disaster porn, this is too much. You know, I don't need my daily doses of media, of social media, to be saturated with outrage, and it's bad for my heart rate. You know, I'd rather have a second espresso than a second helping of shocking news from various corners of the world. And certainly we can see politicians and corporations also taking advantage of that in the development of digital culture. There are a number of populist politicians that I can think of who are very readily dismissing reports that are troubling, maybe even intended to shame them by saying this is trumped up, it's fake, it's false, it's blown out of proportion, etc. They're ready to dismiss this precisely because they know that a number of their supporters have compassion fatigue or are ready to reject it as voyeuristic and as globalist. You know, this has become in English. You know, it has become a word from the far right, from Bannon types, Steve Bannon types, who say, you know, we should look after our own local and national interests and not really care what's happening in other continents and other countries. And when we can't be shamed about what our country might be doing somewhere else. You know, it's just, you know, both corporations and politicians are becoming more shameless, right? So especially somebody like Donald Trump, instead of professing shame and changing course about any number of individual things that he did as a person before being elected to the office that were revealed during the last election campaign, or things that he's been doing since then, anytime that a journalist or anybody else, another politician, tries to point it out and shame him publicly, he doesn't even react to that in the traditional way of either deflecting or pretending that it didn't happen. He actually charges ahead and becomes more offensive. It says, yes, you know, I did say this sexist thing, I did say some ugly things about women, I'm going to be even more ugly right now. I did say those racist things, I did say things against Africans, I'm going to be even more offensive now. So that's a big problem when you're dealing with both corporate and political actors. You're seeking to shame them into changing their course of action, but they're utterly shameless. The next problem, the next rift that we have to talk about is that on the one hand, the international community declares its commitment to democracy, to transparency, to human rights, but on the other hand, it doesn't have a very good track record in actually protecting human rights. It failed to stop the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. It did not stop the ethnic cleansing campaigns in former Yugoslavia, even after the United Nations troops came in. It did not do much about Russia's brutal reaction to Chechnya's declaration of independence. It did not stop or mitigate the impact of civil wars in Somalia or Burundi or Syria, or change much about the reign of terror by violent factions in Afghanistan. So we have a UN Commission on Human Rights that continues to catalog disappearances, arbitrary executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, religious intolerance, the sale of children, the number of displaced persons, cases of extreme poverty, racism, etc., as violations of human rights. But we can also see an increasing discrepancy between human rights law and humanitarian principles, because as I said, sometimes in order to try and impose not just shame and international disapproval, but something more tangible, the United Nations tend to agree on sanctions, right? Sanctions against Iraq, against Iran, against Cuba, South Africa, Serbia, etc. And you could argue that sanctions actually inflict more human suffering. Sanctions are actually against humanitarian concerns. They make things worse on the side of the receiving entities. So in our contemporary hyper-connected but very selective media situation, where digital culture is dominated by social media, by apps, and by advertising, you could argue that this produces consent around certain political and, more importantly, corporate values, and that human rights don't really figure there as much as they used to. It's already clear that in the debate around the potentially damaging role that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other media may have had in the elections in the United Kingdom around Brexit, in the United States around the last presidential election, etc. They don't want to see themselves as a traditional media function with a human filter, with a censorship capacity. They say we're just a technical platform and we're not going to intervene in how people represent what is happening. So any kind of acts of representation that affects local as well as global ideas on social and economic justice is contested, and corporate control of online media impacts the freedom of expression even when governments do not. So as the internet increasingly transforms the notion of intervention, of humanitarian and political intervention, there are some people who are suggesting that citizen journalism can create new forms of witnessing, right? So the optimistic spin on social media is that instead of relying on photojournalism, on professional TV journalists, newspaper journalists, we can now rely on the ordinary person with a cell phone, with a mobile phone. But they don't have the same amplification of their witnessing. And in fact, often their signals are lost in a lot of noise because they do not have the kind of reach, the kind of endorsement of some of the larger websites or social media platforms. This might mean that press freedom, the idea of press freedom, needs to be reformulated or rejuvenated with the rise of new digital channels, because increasingly the channels that tend to take the most attention from the most people are not actually upholding the idea of neutral reporting, of potentially also using that platform to shame corporate or political entities anywhere in the world. So this leads us to the last question. And again, I apologize that I'm going very fast. At least I apologize to those who are here in the room now. Anybody who's seeing this later can always pause and read over the slides at their own time. But this already came up in the discussion a couple of days ago. Are there information rights, access rights in the age of digital media that would lead us to argue that the internet must be accessible as a basic human right? And I'm curious about how people see this in Brazil. So it's not just a question of access to the internet as online services, but really access to a free and open forum that can approximate a public sphere. This will be particularly interesting in the age of self-quarantine and social distancing, where we're less likely to go out in the street, in the square, and get together with like-minded people and yell, because that's now not recommended. Right? So we're making it even easier for certain authoritarian forms of politics, because they all tell us to stay home and be happy, watch some more movies, listen to some more music, and not protest anything or engage in an open dialogue. So is there anybody who has an opinion on internet access as a basic right in Brazil? Is this being discussed in Brazil at all?
I'm not sure if I'm right on this assessment, but I think there was some discussion when internet access had something to do to be in a specific place. So how, in that sense, that people need to go to LAN houses or maybe have the right to use internet at their own school and things like that. I'm guessing, and also I vaguely remember that the one laptop per person project, it kind of hit it here around Lula's presidency, but I don't recall what exactly happened in terms of how that became a thing of a project. I don't know, maybe an hypothesis of internet's becoming more and more invisible. So the idea of not having access is something that you don't see, or you can see it. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with that. Maybe now the thing is more regarding censorship and something from the 90s, the netiquette that people used to say by that time. Now maybe it's back in terms of what it's supposed to be. There's a slang in Brazil that I don't know if the same one in the US is canceling people because they say this or that on the internet. That's just some ideas that occur to me. I don't know if it... Fala pouco.
A gente tem o Marco Civil da Internet, que é uma lei de 2014, e eu lembro que nessa época teve bastante discussão com relação ao uso da internet, se deveria ser livre, ou se o governo deveria interferir, e também, inclusive, depois teve algumas tentativas de restringir o acesso da internet, né? Essa lei de 2014 foi da época do presidente Lula, mas depois, eu acho que foi no governo do Michel Temer, teve uma discussão com relação a restringir o acesso, né? Isso foi bastante discutido. Era isso que eu queria colocar.
Eu me lembrava de ter ouvido algumas discussões sobre isso na esfera legal, assim, né? Tanto tem essa questão de restrição, mas também existem propostas de emenda à Constituição para colocar na Constituição brasileira que o acesso à internet seja um direito básico, um direito fundamental. Acho que isso é bem possível de passar, porque a emenda à Constituição no Brasil é algo que é banal, mas é algo que é meio, acho que sem efetividade, assim, né? Porque existem tantos outros direitos fundamentais na nossa Constituição que não são respeitados.
But on commercial side, vou falar em português. Do lado comercial, algumas operadoras de telefone ofertam acessos a alguns fóruns, alguns sites de internet por fora do plano de cobertura. Por exemplo, o WhatsApp, né? Livre de dados, né? Livre do uso de dados. Então, o WhatsApp, etc. Eles acabam se tornando fóruns pervasivos hoje em dia para a quantidade de celulares que nós temos. O Brasil talvez seja o segundo país com maior número de celulares, se não me engano. Enfim. Então, comercialmente, tem um lado aí também.
Só complementando o que ele disse, eu acho que ao mesmo tempo que tem essas operadoras que oferecem, vamos dizer, um pacote livre, o acesso à internet no Brasil ainda é muito caro. Qualquer operadora que tu vai colocar, seja na tua casa para ter Wi-Fi ou outro tipo de internet, a gente paga um valor muito alto e também uma cobertura para colocar só no telefone, que seja. Quando tu vai completar um pacote de dados, também é muito caro e eles oferecem, na verdade, uma quantidade limitada. Então, acho que isso é uma outra coisa que tem que ver, porque eu já vi em outros lugares que a gente chega e que tem postos de internet de acesso grátis. Aqui no Brasil é uma coisa ainda muito difícil. Existe uma operadora que, em alguns lugares, coloca pontos de acesso livre, mas, ao mesmo tempo, para tu poder acessar, tu tem que ser assinante dessa operadora na tua casa. Então, tu tem na tua casa, e se tu está em outro lugar e tem um desses pontos de acesso, tu pode acessar. Mas a gente não tem um lugar que a gente chegue e vai ter um acesso livre à internet.
Sem falar que o Brasil é muito grande e ele não se pode dizer que toda a população tem acesso à internet. Na verdade, grande parte da população, principalmente a população mais pobre ou a população que mora mais em lugares mais afastados, não tem acesso, né? Então, isso é um fato.
Quanto à quantidade da população que tem acesso efetivo à internet, dados do ano passado dizem que atualmente 80% da população brasileira tem acesso à internet e 20% não possui nenhuma forma de acesso, nem gratuita, nem paga.
Just in the chat, Fabrício, the jiu-jitsu guy, said that 3G is also responsible. He's quoting Eduardo Pelanda, a scholar from PUC. 3G is very important in Brazil for non-favorable areas of other sort of internet access as a way of probably reaching 80% due to 3G.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. So what I hear from the various comments is that, it reflects the situation in many other countries where we can see two kinds of digital divide. There's the basic digital divide that not everybody has access to any form of the internet, even not through a mobile phone with a limited window into something that is online. But the second, and maybe just as consequential distinction or divide, is that some of us have access to the internet in a large, free, broad, and open kind of sense, where you can find pretty much anybody, anything, whereas many people increasingly are going to be in a walled garden, in a very limited, controlled corporate environment that can more easily be calibrated by a corporate or even censored by a governmental entity. So we see this around the world, where internet shutdowns are also becoming favorite tools of governments. These are just some slides grabbed from recent coverage. There are some places in Canada who are particularly good at researching this and observing what happens in India, in Iran, in Myanmar, and other countries in Russia, where internet shutdowns, temporary or longer lasting, simply government ordering a phone company or any other internet providers to temporarily turn off internet, any kind of access for the whole country or certain areas of the country. In India, as you know, this is has to do with the suppression of Muslims. In certain Arabic countries, it has to do with the mitigation or suppression of any kind of protest organization. In other countries, there might be different incidents that lead the government to say, you know, the internet is now not a good thing, and we're going to turn this off temporarily, right? So, and we can even see this play out both ways. We can say, on the one hand, the internet is the public sphere. It is where we can communicate with each other. On the other hand, increasingly we hear from a lot of people that the internet is essentially the new opium for the people. It's a distraction. It's just a crowd control to keep everybody happy with cat videos and TikTok dance videos, any number of things that are depoliticized and immobilizing the voters, etc. So you can see this in the treatment of the Rohingya, the persecuted Muslim minority in Myanmar, where the government has instituted an internet blackout for months, which makes it very difficult for anybody living there to get access to any kind of information for basic educational or other needs. But it also means that if you're trying to report from there, if you're a journalist, you're trying to report from there, it's very difficult or impossible to get news out. So Myanmar, when it was facing genocide allegations at the United Nations top court after military operations in 2017, could just say, where's the evidence? Because the evidence can't easily get out. You also see this in India. You see this in Iran, where the supreme leaders or the Supreme Court in India's case can impose certain limitations. And in some cases, you'll see those restrictions lifted again. Kashmir, people had access again to mobile data or to social media after a while. But the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis, for instance, is tracking. It's difficult to establish exactly who is doing this at what point, because people who are affected by it, by definition, cannot tell you that they have been cut off. So you have to monitor traffic. You have to do traffic analysis by other means and see how many computers or phones are being active on an average day. And if there's suddenly a precipitous drop-off, you can induce that it's been suppressed by government or corporate, or a combination of government and corporate measures. So almost a decade ago, the previous United Nations Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression, not the one that I quoted in the last lecture, but the predecessor in that office, named Frank LaRue, submitted a report to the United Nations Human Rights Council, quote, exploring key trends and challenges to the rights of all individuals to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds of media. That report made 88 recommendations on the promotion and protection of the rights to freedom of expression online, including several recommendations to secure access to the internet for all. There are other recommendations that call on individual member states to respect online anonymity, to adopt privacy and data protection laws, and to decriminalize defamation, because that's a tool that's used to attack opposition politicians and parties. So on the next slide, it might be a little too small for you to read if you're in the room here, because I tried to get the 3 important recommendations on one slide. The recommendations explain that, maybe I'll read it out to you because I can see it. Can you see it in the back? Kind of. You know, we all wear glasses. The majority of us has glasses already. So, unlike any other medium, it says, the internet enables individuals to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds instantaneously and inexpensively across national borders. By vastly expanding the capacity of individuals to enjoy the right to freedom of opinion and expression, which is an enabler of other human rights, the internet boosts economic, social, and political development and contributes to the progress of humankind as a whole. In the next one, it says, while blocking and filtering measures deny users access to specific content on the internet, states have also taken measures to cut off access to the internet entirely. The Special Rapporteur considers that a violation of various rights. The Special Rapporteur, therefore, in number 79, calls on all states to ensure that their national and local internet access is maintained at all times, including, and it probably should say especially, during times of political unrest. And then later on in number 85 out of 88, it says, given that the internet has become an indispensable tool for realizing a range of other human rights, in combating inequality, accelerating development, human progress, ensuring universal access to the internet should be a priority. It's almost like it's the right to have rights. Right? You know, internet access is not in itself the end goal, but internet access allows you to enjoy the other human rights that are relevant. And now, of course, that recommendation was eloquent enough to get the United Nations to vote in favor of endorsing that. So it was kind of a trick question. Like many of my questions to the audience, it was a trick question when I asked you to opine on whether the access to the internet should be a human right. The UN report effectively did declare internet access a human right in 2012, following up from this report in 2011. And this made news around the globe. The United Nations has declared that every human should have access to the internet, free and open internet, not just through a walled garden, social media, or an echo chamber of ideological filtering, but to the full breadth and depth of human free expression online. And right away, there were opinion pieces that opposed that and objected to this. And I just put one here because Vint Cerf is an influential and important engineer in the history of the internet. For those of you who don't geek out like I do on the history of the internet, Vint Cerf was one of the important contributors to the software that makes the internet function the way it does now. And in tribute to his pioneering role much earlier on in the history of the internet, he has been for a long time a Google evangelist. So he's a Google employee. And here in his op-ed printed in the New York Times, he's arguing that internet access is not a human right. So I found it interesting that even somebody like Vint Cerf, who is an internet pioneer, and without whose contributions the internet would not have become what it did become. Here, he's very clearly writing as a Google employee, as a figurehead, as one of the more important engineers working for Google, again arguing that as a corporate technical service, this is just a platform. And you know, it's just one platform of many. As dominant as Google may be, they never want to admit how dominant they are. And he does admit in the first paragraph, but I encourage you to read the rest of this if you can get a Portuguese version, or maybe Google Translate will translate Google speech to you. He says, yes, the internet played an important role from the streets of Tunis to Tahrir Square and beyond, with protests that were built on the internet or on the power of mobile phones that are internet enabled. And through these demonstrations, we can see that thousands of people turned out to participate and protest and change the politics of their country that might not have happened without the internet offering the ability to communicate and organize and publicize everywhere instantaneously. But in the rest of his piece, he says, that does not mean that the United Nations can just tell us, make it easy and free to access. Because of course, Google needs to, as one of the main providers, they're not in the business of providing this really for free, even though a lot of their services are ostensibly free. This needs to be funded somehow. And as I said in the beginning, advertising and marketing is basically the backbone of any services that look like they're free. And if we took this away, the barriers of the digital divide, the economic digital divide, would go up quite significantly and would be more expensive for anybody to use mobile data or computer access to the internet. And inversely, if we accept the bargain, which all of us implicitly accept, that corporate interests, marketing and advertising interests are subsidizing our apparently free access to the internet, then those are the influential players that will have corporate and governmental filter functions and prevent perhaps the internet from being as universally free as the United Nations called for. So not only is there a little bit of a debate over whether human rights are as universal as they're declared, that's an ideological debate, but there's also a debate over the relationship that seems very close between human rights discourse and media discourse. And now we have this significant cleaving in the almost decade after the United Nations report came out. And we see that increasingly internet censorship filtering is being used, even in countries that you do not suspect of being so heavy-handed. If we had more time, but I'm going to finish in 2 minutes, I could tell you about several occasions where even in certain communities in the United States, where you would think there's plenty of access options, services were temporarily curtailed in order to cut down on protests or in order to cut down on gatherings in the street. So it's a double-edged sword in a number of ways. Thank you for attending and listening, and also oi to those who might be listening and watching later if this is recorded and or streamed. Are there any comments or questions or things that I said and shouldn't have said or did say, but wasn't quite formulating correctly, or something that I should have said and did not say? Then let's go and take a social distancing break, and then we'll come back and I'll give another short version of the talk that I was scheduled to give tonight at 8. Thank you very much. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. It's not 8 o'clock tonight yet, but I am time traveling into the near future, into a conference that is not taking place. But while we have this room, I thought we'd have the opportunity to record a version of my talk that I would have given. I've been looking at the discourse of error around digital culture for a while now. And so today I want to talk about the notion of the error at the end of the internet. So unlike some of the talks that I've given in the class about internet culture that is more or less current internet culture, digital culture, this talk is explicitly a historical talk going back to the early days of the internet, and in particular to a repository that tells us a lot about the development of the internet, that is archived as the RFC. So you can look at the RFCs. These are requests for comments. They've been collected since the early days, since 1969, by the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF. You can look up on their website. It's cataloged there. There used to be very informal working notes of the then often graduate students and then later professionals who were advancing the technology of the early internet. These working notes had been initiated by a man called Steve Crocker. I'll show you a picture of him in a moment. And later shepherded by another early internet pioneer for over 20 years, 28 years in fact, until he passed away, John Postel. So you can find all of the RFCs on the IETF website in a simple format, RFC and then a 4-digit number, and then I'm going to point out a number of the classic ones. And I'm particularly interested in how the early internet tried to deal with the omnipresence of errors. So digital culture is predicated on communication efficiencies to such an extent that it often veils and obscures the sources of faults and errors. We like to pretend that the internet is frictionless and instantaneous and omnipresent. But if you look at the RFC 1958, which was actually written by Steve Crocker, one of the early compilers of these RFCs, you'll see he points out that, quote, a good analogy for the development of the internet is that of constantly renewing the individual streets and buildings of a city rather than raising the city and then rebuilding it. Right? So it's an ongoing tweak of a now quite elderly, or let's say middle-aged edifice. If we look at computer-mediated communication from the vantage point of errors, it's not to diminish the contribution of those who design ergonomic interfaces or engineer trustworthy data transmission. And the point is also not to restate Murphy's Law, but to heighten awareness for the potential of contingency, of miscommunication, of errors under ever more tightly controlled conditions. A lot of engineers also tend to dismiss errors as almost exclusively the realm of humans. Right? The famous acronym there is EBKAC, error between keyboard and chair. This is the person who seems to be always at fault from the point of view of the engineer, but I'm going to try to question some of that overly simple distinction. Machines are always running perfectly and humans are always sources of error. This is the RFC 1958 that I quoted a moment ago. It was published in June 1996. Pointed out that over the first quarter century since the ARPANET started, various measures of the size of the internet have increased by factors between 1,000 for the backbone speed and a large, several orders of magnitude bigger number of hosts. And so the architectural principles inevitably change. And therefore, as it says on the bottom of that page, the quote I just gave you, the good analogy is renewing individual streets and buildings rather than rebuilding the city after raising it. And what that means, though, is that we also inherit, we also carry over things that are potential sources of error in the early internet. So famously, and this is an anecdote most of you will probably have already heard, the very first transmission between two otherwise incompatible computers, namely one at UCLA and one at the Stanford Research Institute, was already characterized by an error. Here on the left, you see Steve Crocker, who helped invent the instructions for the internet. You know, he's the one who suggested the compilation of these working notes and RFCs. And he was interviewed by Wired saying, you know, you were there at the very first connection. What was that? And he says, in October 1969, the very first attempt to get some communication between our machine at UCLA, which was Sigma 7, and Doug Engelbart's machine in Northern California, an STS 940 at SRI, crashed. And I actually, you know, I was hired at the University of California by a history professor who is no longer alive, but who was at the University of California at the time already in 1969 and remembers that. Mark Poster, and he became very interested in internet culture later, but in 1969 he couldn't understand the excitement of his colleagues and said, why do you have to make a UCLA computer talk to a Stanford computer? Couldn't you just pick up the phone? And they said, no, we actually were on the phone because we wanted to have a second channel available to see, you know, do you see the L? Yes. Do you see the O? Yes. And before they could finish the message log in, they didn't understand that because, you know, one of the motivation for this early internet, one of the motivation for building routers, the famous interface messaging processor that Bolt, Bernick, and Newman provided to make these connections between computers possible for resource sharing and other reasons. These incompatible computers had different expectations, so the SIRI machine actually thought after L and O, it's probably going to be login, but that kind of anticipation ended up crashing the connection. The L was typed and they got an L, the O was typed and they got an O, but when they typed the G, and it wasn't the GIN, the connection crashed and they had to reboot. So informed by that, you know, erroneous birthday, we can see a number of other ways in which the early internet engineers already realized that they need to deal with error checking. Here is the RFC1, the very first of the collection of many thousand working notes written by Steve Crocker. The point is made by Jeff Rulifson at SRI that error checking at major software interfaces is always a good thing. BBN, the engineers in Boston, who claim that the hardware they built will be as reliable as anything. Yeah, we believe them, but we still want error checking. So transmission errors as communication errors have known, at least since Shannon, have always been unavoidable given the presence of noise in any kind of communication channel, where there always is a sum total of random signals that interfere with the communication signal. And in digital media in particular, an error understood as that difference between an estimate or forecast and the actual value can occur at any time. And in fact, this is one of the big takeaways from the Macy conferences, where they pointed out that analog devices show tendencies for errors to appear in the least significant place, but they're limited by the precision of manufacture. They could not be combined to secure additional places. Analog devices don't scale as quickly as digital devices. Digital devices might show errors in any place, which is a limit inherent in all positional nomenclatures. They never acquired extreme accuracy, but they can always combine to secure other places at the same price per place as previously. And if we look at the history of error codes in particular on the internet, we see distinct phases in the development of computer-computer communication. There's some more complex examples here up on the screen. This is still 1970, so the internet is barely 1 year old. In the case of input error, you want to reallocate resources. In the case of a user-oriented protocol, you're going to get user errors, of course, user input. But there's also the awareness early on. It's not just about implementing client-server handshakes between machines. There's also estimating round trip times, if this is physically further apart or technically there's a delay. You need to set a reasonably high initial timeout to avoid a bad feedback, a recursion. Because if there's a broken or a malicious name server, for instance, that lists itself as one of the name servers to query again, an unsuspecting client could end up resending the same query to the same server again and again and get caught in bad infinity. So avoiding infinite loops that are far more likely between machines than between humans. I made this joke the other day when I tried to explain the distributed denial of service attack, which is the weaponization of that infinity loop. They can tie up resources to such an extent as to shut down part of the internet, shut down a server. So later you'll see that there are RFC 1537, for instance, establishes that every internet reachable computer needs a name in the DNS, in the domain name system, so that you avoid inconsistent or missing or corrupted entries. Then another early protocol is the mail protocol, SMTP, send mail transfer protocol. So mail is almost as old as the internet, which explains why people student age today, think that that's not that's something for grandfathers to use, but not what the young people use. But it's still extant, it's still around, and still relying on the TCP port 25, and people are in the RFCs are studying how to avoid certain kind of error codes in the sending and receiving of mail. So for instance, in RFC 3155 from August 2001, they diagnose rather wryly, I quote, "The rapidly growing internet is being accessed by an increasingly wide range of devices over an increasingly wide variety of links. At least some of these links do not provide the degree of reliability that hosts expects, and this expansion into unreliable links causes some internet protocols to perform poorly," end quote. But perhaps most instructive for the history of errors on the internet is the hypertext transfer protocol, the HTTP. And there's a number of RFCs in the body of notes collected, RFC 2068, RFC 2616, and elsewhere, that describe how web servers and web clients can signal the success or failure of certain connections. And that's where we can get into nomenclature about different classes of errors. So there's some kind of meta information about what type of error. So you can already see a classification of errors by different type. So what you see is that in the early internet, whether it's computer-computer connection for file transfer, as you see here up on the left, or for mail, or for any other kind of connection, people are already observing so many errors that they try to, domesticate them by trying to classify them. And in hypertext transfer protocol, there are the 100 class, there are informational. The 200 class indicates that a request was received and accepted. Codes in the 300 class indicate a need for redirection. So for instance, error 301, this resource has been moved permanently. Error 307, this is a temporary redirect. The 400 class of status codes is for cases where clients making a request from a server seem to be in the wrong. They seem to have made a bad request. And examples for status codes in the 400 class are 401, this is an unauthorized request. 403, this request is forbidden. We don't allow that kind of request. Or perhaps best known on the web, error 404, not found. Right? And the interesting thing about the RFC is that once they're published and shared, they never change. So even if they have any kind of errors themselves, these are documents trying to weed out and avoid errors, but if they have error themselves, technical errata and editorial errata are going to be maintained. So that's one of the few resources on the internet where we see version control. Many other places on the internet, if you try to do a historical study, it's difficult because websites supersede each other. There's no easy way to find the Unicinos website from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There's no easy way to find other websites unless they've been archived on the Internet Archive or in some other initiatives like that. On the RFC site, we can see everything as it was provided at that time. So it's a nice resource for internet history. This was the quote from the Macy conferences about the difference between analog error and digital error. But I'm going to get to quickly to the implementation errors and suggested fixes in the domain name system, and then the different classes of mobile extensions, etc. There are links with errors. You can browse through thousands of these RFCs on your own time. It says the rapidly growing internet is being accessed by an increasingly wide range of devices, as I quoted. Specifically, congestion control is one concern, and trying to classify different errors. And here's the client error in the 400 class. So if a web server responds to your request for a page with 401, then your request did not have the correct credentials. If the response is 403, then the server understood your request but refuses to fill it, and authorization would not help. Right? So that's the difference between 401 and 403. It has less to do with authorization. The difference is that that request should not be repeated, while in the prior case in 401, you could return a second time with the correct credentials. Error 404 indicates that the server has not found anything matching their request without indicating whether this status is temporary or permanently. We've probably all seen 404. It's one of the most common things to occur on the web because as we enact it, it lacks version control. It could be an old link. It could be a mistyped link. Etc. There are many different ways to end up at an error 404 screen. And despite all kinds of useful initiatives to archive important pages, there always are sites that have moved, links that are broken, etc. There's also, and if we had time, we could go indulge in some internet memes. There's a persistent urban myth that 404 is named that way because that was the room at CERN where Tim Berners-Lee was working on the early web, etc. That's not the case. It's really just a classification of errors in the 400 class, unauthorized or forbidden or not found or method not allowed, etc. I have a colleague at the University of California who is an artist and an activist at UC San Diego. And a while ago, in an action that was meant to protest the policies of his employer, of the University of California, he actually programmed a little web applet that would search the server of the president's office, which is ucop.edu, for certain kinds of keywords. And then because those files and keywords are not there, the website would respond that that's not available. So he would return visible messages online requesting files named justice or freedom or human rights, and the website of the president will then visibly return the message, justice not found, freedom not found, human rights not found. This was a decade ago, and he had just received tenure, security of employment, but nonetheless, because he was directing this kind of activism against his employer, there were actually some politicians who thought that he should be fired because he's attacking his own institution. That luckily did not happen, but he got a lot of attention, he got a lot of press for this kind of, he calls it digital disobedience, net activism, this kind of action, exploiting the omnipresence of error 404, exploiting the way that the internet deals with this kind of particular error. There are other error codes in the 400 range that include 408 as an indication of a timeout. It took too long to get a response. 413 for a request that is just too large. 415 for an unsupported media type. You asked for a particular media format, we cannot satisfy that type. And then in the 500 class, the codes indicate that this is not the client that's erring, but it admits an error on the server side. So 500, for instance, indicates an internal server error, any unexplained condition on the server side that prevents that server from fulfilling your request, or error 503 notifies you as the client that this service is currently not working. So it's interesting that we have the possibility early on the internet to distinguish between client error and server error, even though most machines that are connected to each other on the internet can be, either of them at any given time. They can be both serving and requesting to be clients. So let's step back for a moment and just think about what we actually mean by error, right? So I've pointed out that the internet had to deal with a lot of different technical and human errors, and that one response by engineers was to classify errors and to basically build a capacity to not only allow for error, but to even anticipate certain kinds of errors and classify them and have a prepared response. But in our natural language, the word error describes a range of situations from moral or legal contexts to more strictly technical or managerial contexts. And there are connotations in Western culture of deviating from a correct path. That's what the linguistic root of error suggests. It arises from a need for guidance to avoid blindly going astray. And more and more contemporary use of the word error has more and more association with technical errors, whereas human fallibility is just always taken as read. Humans are not perfect, but machines we expect to work well until they fail, and then we talk about their errors. And in turn, there are types of technical errors that can be either seen as unavoidable, as Shannon argued about all physical channels, or as something to debug. And there are many systemic approaches devoted to correction. And there's also a curious thing which in most languages that I know about, the word error is used both for an act and for the result of that act. So there's already maybe a categorical confusion, if you want to be strict about it. There might be some consequences to that conflation. And if you think about it as distinct from other situations, the recognition of an act of commission of an error is context dependent. Right? So it's not simply a false claim. If I lie to you, that's not an error because I know it is false. It's an error if I'm convinced I'm telling you something that is accurate, and it afterwards turns out that I misspoke, or that I had false information, or that somebody has better information. So the objective falsity of the statement has to coincide with a subjective conviction that it's not false. And therefore, that also means that recognition of the impact of the error, not the act, but the impact of the error, is dependent on context or consequence, and often on a retrospective realization that an utterance or an act were erroneous, and that recognition is necessarily delayed. We get a lot of philosophers worrying about this. Engineers don't tend to philosophize about this a lot. They just try to mitigate the impact. They know that the act itself is unavoidable. They know that machines will fail, humans will fail. They know that an internet is by definition human-computer interaction. So you're going to have, multiple sources of possible error. And the only way that the internet could grow the way it did was simply by not only assuming this would happen, but by anticipating that that will happen, and by trying to engineer ways around it. Hegel, for instance, argued that the error as such is to take a singular observation or situation for the whole, since only a fully dialectical context can amount to the truth. Marx, turning Hegel on from the head onto its feet, tries to turn this into a social factor, arguing that error is a matter of ideology. Nietzsche's willfully irrational approach can in turn be read as a turn to psychology. And then Heidegger pointed out that we have quite an ancient tradition in Western philosophy talking about error. He goes to the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides of Elea, who proposed that error was connected to a dynamic sense of being rather than not being. Plato, who held that error was characterized by non-existent non-facts, versus a more generous account which might have viewed error as merely an incorrect characterization of actual facts. And we inherit a lot of this legacy of the philosophizing about the human capacity for error, when Heidegger, for instance, writes, following these ancient traces, that humans don't merely stray into errancy, they're always astray in errancy. Even Foucault claims, life is what is capable of error. It seems like a very grand definitional claim. Derrida, who did not agree on a lot of things with Foucault, tried to set up and rework a binary between the singularity of the event associated with living beings versus machines' calculable programming and automatic repetitions. But some people worry that that kind of sneaks in a covert humanism into the back door of technological determinism, and says, humans are essentially different. Kittler theorizes technical media as emerging from the non-human as well, where humans provide spontaneous responses to unforeseen events. The machine is only capable of what was set out for it in advance. For Kittler, noise is not non-social technical phenomenon, even though it has social consequences. And that seems to be what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the internet. These are machines that have been programmed by people, but nonetheless, to be as accurate as possible in reflecting good or imperfect communication requests, requests that can or cannot be fulfilled, etc. But the engineers don't worry as much about the eradication of error. They simply accept that we'll have multiple sources of errors. And before we subsume that philosophical tradition, into saying, machines can only do what humans program to do, so when machines make an error, it's always the fault of the programmers, therefore sort of relegating it again to human fallibility, we have to realize that it's also possible that we've designed something that works for a while, and then deteriorates. You know, I can point to machines around us that deteriorate for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with the fact that humans built or programmed them. It just have to do with various other factors of deterioration. Maybe we could go into another side discourse, as again, a religious discourse around erring, which in the religious tradition used to have only two possible outcomes. You can repent and come back into the fold, or you can remain cast out as a sinner. Pre-modern thought had in that way opposed sovereignty and powerlessness as a divine power that creates us, and we as the created do not have a choice about being constituted otherwise or not at all. So wishing to be otherwise would be blasphemous because you are God's creature. And that rejection of contingency, of error, in pre-modern thoughts is often illustrated in the legends of saints in these two modes, right? There's an undeterred allegiance to God into death. You know, you're not going to ever deviate. You're not going to make any errors. You're just going to maintain. Or you can turn away and then correct that error by being redeemed. So you can either be the martyr or you can be the converted sinner. That's the pre-modern figure. In modernity, we are much more used to dealing with humans as lacking guidance. There's no such rejection of contingency. There's only contingency. And one emblematic text is a famous essay from the 60s by J.C.R. Licklider and Rob Taylor about the computer as a communication device. They end with these three terse paragraphs saying that for society, the impact of the computer as a communication device will be good or bad, depending mainly on the question, will to be online be a privilege or a right? That echoes of what we were talking about before. If only a favored segment of the population gets a chance, right, some computer priesthood, to enjoy the advantage of this intelligence amplification that the internet promised in the 60s, then that will exaggerate the discontinuity in the spectrum of intellectual opportunity. On the other hand, if the network idea should prove to do for education what a few have envisioned and hope, surely then it will be a boon to mankind beyond measure. And they even sardonically suggest that in that case, in that scenario, unemployment would disappear from the face of the earth forever. For consider the magnitude of the task of adapting the network software to all the new generations of computer coming closer and closer upon the heels of the predecessors until the entire population of the world is caught up in an infinite crescendo of online interactive debugging. Right? The more sources of error, because more people and more machines are connected, the more sources of error correction until there's no unemployment because we're always all correcting each other's mistakes. Right? There should be the cartoon in here, the famous New Yorker cartoon of a person furiously on the computer saying, "Someone is wrong on the internet." But I don't want to make light of this. This is a 60s utopian vision of what the internet is going to bring about. Of course, we know that it did not develop exactly that way. And the history of mathematics gives pride of place to topology, to trying to figure out routing problems. What is the best connection from one point to another? The famous problem of the bridges of Königsberg that was proposed by Leonhard Euler as one visualization of topology, which gives rise to network topology. Right here on the left, you see the very first connection in 1969 between the UCLA computer and the SRI computer enabled by an internet messaging processor. And then by December, you have some other universities like the University of Utah, UC Santa Barbara, etc., connected again with incompatible machines. And pretty soon, it becomes something that you cannot map on a physical scale. It's difficult to see, here, even on the right, you're still kind of mapped onto the physical the proportions of the United States, once you have Michigan and Dartmouth on the top, or other computers like Illinois and Carnegie Mellon University in the center. In the picture, you see Ralph Barron, who is one of the consultants to RAND, the think tank on the West Coast, explaining his napkin sketch that basically reinvented what a British engineer had already proposed earlier for packet switching. There are three types of networks you can think of. One is the centralized network. And the current communication situation here is kind of like that. There's one person speaking in a one-to-many situation. And if I stop speaking, there's no connection between you and you and you. I'm forgetting about the translator who provides a second way of connecting, but that's also a one-to-many situation. We could think of a decentralized network where there are different groups in a class or different parts of the university or different parts of a corporation that are each locally connected, but there's no easy way from one of the edges to go to another one of the edges without going through local central nodes. And then there is what Barron called the distributed network, where all the different nodes of the net can route in multiple ways around. So you anticipate sources of failure, of error, of local blockage, and you can simply go around that, which reminds us of the famous formulation from the 60s that the internet interprets censorship as failure and routes around it as well. Right? So it's a much more resilient way of networking. And very quickly this becomes something that you can only map in a logical way. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people who say that despite the resilient, redundant structure of the network, there are some customizable error 404 pages that turn that into a source of humor. Right, so I'm talking about the end of the internet here in a metaphorical sense, and there's a significant difference between earlier versions of internet humor on the left and later versions of that same kind of meme, customizable error for 4 pages. As here, you finally reached the end of the internet. There's nothing more to see, no more links to visit. You've done it all. This is the very last page on the very last server at the very far end of the internet. You should now turn off your computer and go do something useful with the rest of your life. Read a book, do some public service, personally interact with your neighbor. Don't do that today, but this is the old nets, right? Plant a tree, and then it even suggests jokingly down there that it's downloading the internet to your local drive. And then there's an error message there as well, which says that, the insufficient memory for drive C. So these earlier iterations of the joke exhort people to shut down their computer and go out. On the right, you see the more recent end of the internet type of meme. That's right, this is the last page on the very last web server of the entire internet. No journey would be complete without a souvenir t-shirt or webcomic from Amazon. Right? So instead of go out and do some public service, you get stay here and get some merchandising. Even as many of these humorous end of the web pages have disappeared, from the 90s onwards, some of them have been archived and can still be referenced, which is in itself an illustration of the resilience of the web. But if the idea of reaching an end of the internet is a joke, it's much less ludicrous to imagine that the net as such could end. Right? Even if it is a distributed reticular structure built for redundancy and error tolerance, as we saw, even if it's built on the assumption that there will be failed connections and dropped packages, lag and latency and jitter, even if it is an infrastructure designed to work around what it inevitably produces, we see from the history of error messages that there are some places where it's hard to see that in a humorous way, because a very real end of the internet, or at least a very real end of the internet as we know it, may come from censorship and privatization from anything that threatens the open core that we can read about in the RFC corpus, right? So the RFCs are still continuing. The RFCs are much more cumbersome and bureaucratic today than they were in the early days. But the internet is not exactly extended in the same direction. The competitive idea behind the layers of the internet translated into a reality that anyone could write an application to convey data, and network providers would serve no gatekeeping role. But more recently, that kind of internet hourglass has put a lot of pressure on the neutrality of that central mediation, and we get to an error code that as recently as June 1999, the RFC 2616 identified, but said is reserved for future use. Right? Error 402, payment required. Right? The internet will end here for you unless you pay. So the problem I have with that is that there are three aspects of this debate worth considering as we digest the end of net neutrality. Net neutrality is the basic expectation that if you and I pay a service provider, such as our telephone or our cable or a satellite company, for internet access, that access should be independent of what I do with that connection. Right? So if you're a gamer, you're particularly concerned perhaps with jitter and latency because games depend on real-time interactions. If you're more interested in streaming video, perhaps even from abroad, which means you might need a VPN, which slows down the services a little. You're more concerned with the data throughput. That is not necessarily jitter and latency, but although there can also be lag that affects your reception. If you are in the business of doing things online that are interactive, whether it's chat, video conferencing, soon we will all be doing a lot more video conferencing and internet telephony. You have different worries about the quality of your connection, etc. But that should not matter to your provider. Even though they put different burdens on the network, your provider should not charge you more or less depending on what you do with the internet access. You've paid for internet access, you should get internet access. There should also be no price breaks for fans of proprietary content or premium extracted or slower service if you get service from somewhere else. So in some countries, let's pretend that we're in a parallel universe in Brazil where internet access is sold by large media companies that also have newspapers, television stations, etc. They should not make it cheaper or faster for you if you look at the news from the sources that they own, or slower, more expensive if you want to read news sources that are outside that corporate umbrella. But that's exactly what we're beginning to see. Secondly, I would argue that governments all around the world should protect free speech and not discriminate against any kind of legal content. We often see governments discriminate against illegal content, but as long as content, game, video, chat, whatever it might be, is legal in your country, there should be no penalty on it just because it's more onerous on the network or whatever, more data. And third, even if we know that there are now nefarious actors on the internet, that should not result in any kind of public policy that amounts to tiered access to the public sphere, where if you can afford it, you get full access, and if you pay less, then you only get a preview and then you're cut off. You know, as if the internet was some kind of metered access. But as this is on the wane, we see around the globe, the healthiest defense of an open society against enemies, you should argue, is robust public debate, which you can only get if you have a lot of people accessing the public sphere, not systemic bias that chills free speech. Yet in the absence of net neutrality, money becomes even more powerful in shaping political opinion, which in short is error 402, payment required. Even though in 1999 that was reserved for future use, I would argue that we have basically arrived at that end of the internet as we know it. As early as 2006, commentators issued dire warnings about the closing of the net. I quote, "Those with the deepest pockets, corporations, special interest groups, and major advertisers get preferred treatment. Content from these providers would have first priority on our computer and television screens, while information seen as undesirable, such as peer-to-peer communications, could be relegated to a slow lane or simply shut out," end quote. This turns the public sphere effectively into a pay-to-play arena where powerful corporations can pay to see their content served at fast speeds, while their competition, not to mention nonprofits, may be squeezed into slower tiers with less visibility. This not only creates barriers, it raises the specter of internet censorship. Why should policymakers and citizens wish for a net of walled gardens? What's the upside of backroom deals with content providers or of data caps biased for or against different types of use? Should your internet company influence what search engine you use, what shows you watch, what news you read? Any kind of decisions against net neutrality not only ignores all kinds of technical advice, but also ignores political reality. And yes, I know that argument could be made that the internet needs to be made more secure and that privatization, deregulation may help service providers fend off hackers, social media manipulators, and fake news peddlers. But this never required abandoning net neutrality, right? So like I said, we could discuss a number of cases where, for instance, at a concert, certain kinds of illegal political speech is de-emphasized, or where governments or corporations or both together throttle file sharing sites like BitTorrent or eDonkey or Gnutella because it goes against legal protections in that particular country, or where we see countries, governments, block text messaging by activists, like in Hong Kong for the demonstrations. You know, we already know that these things happen without suspending everything that we expect from the internet. So these kinds of local political decisions are made without abandoning the open internet. Abandoning net neutrality promises to lift the profit margins of internet providers, but at what cost to democracy or to an open media landscape and a robust public sphere? And that, you know, clearly competition will not fix this because most of us are basically facing a local monopoly. There are not multiple ways to get to free and open internet. The only incentive for the corporations here is to raise tolls. So it's abandoning net neutrality really is abandoning the internet. So I'm going to close by saying that from the request for comments in general from this RFC documents and from parsing HTTP errors in particular as we look at the hypertext transfer protocol as we navigate around the web in particular, it should be clear that the net was never designed to avoid mistakes or to suppress mistakes or detour or lapses. The original worry always was instead whether there might be a point when no disruptive events could occur, because that would indicate a fatal stagnation, right? Just a lack of traffic means a lack of ideas. Right? If nobody participates, that's the worst possible outcome. You know, ostensibly it's the pacification of people by the internet, but it's no longer the internet. It's actually, that would be the fatal error, where we could say the net's health is its complexity, and to bring the complexity down to monotony is a disease. There is never a true path across the internet, only the attempt to generate additional paths. That is the story of the internet. That is the structure of the distributed network. That story has been retold ever since 1969, and to that extent, if the telling of stories plays a decisive role in the establishment of networks, then the means or medium by which such telling is disseminated will constitute an essential factor in the shaping and maintaining of networks. So I would say that the unstinting end of media studies must be to tell the stories found in the RFC corpus in general and in the HTTP error codes in particular, as geeky and weird and nerdy as that might seem, because it helps us ward off tendentious interpretations and policies that could easily be the end of the internet. Thank you.
Hello. Ok. Perguntas, comentários?
In any language, Portuguese, lead speak for gamers.
Well, let's try a question in terms of provoking you in terms of the whole week that you've been here. How would you connect your previous topics with this particular part of the idea of an internet culture? In some way, with this work, you're telling us to look into places that we usually don't look, to think about what it is internet culture and how do we behave around it. Somehow we don't see the HTTP universe as a medium as we used to 20 years ago, although it is still here. Do you think that maybe error as a technical/social factor should be more considered when we discuss such things as the right of access to internet, the right to hack or to practice hacktivism, and such on? So I'm trying to a way to you to entwine your classes in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, at least to me, these things are all connected. When I talk about internet culture and internet history, the same concerns seem to pop up, whether we look at hacktivism or whether we look at creative culture, aesthetic communication, internet art, digital culture, and aesthetic communication under the conditions of computers. It's always about the possibility, the positive, hopeful possibility that something unexpected may occur, that we will reserve a space for contingency, for something that is not programmed, for something that's not always predicted. Because as I said a moment ago, that would be the most disappointing, monotonous, uniform kind of society that no longer has aesthetic culture, that no longer has art. Because artists and musicians and writers are always trying to offer experiences and share experiences that deal with an unpredictable reservoir. And the more digital culture seems to emphasize frictionless commerce, instantaneous communication, etc., the more some other corners of digital culture find ways of kind of resisting that and of pointing out that there are some reserves in here that are perhaps just as interesting or more interesting, that are just as worth or more worthy of communicating, of sharing, whether that is explicitly in an aesthetic mode or whether it is simply to humanize the communication that otherwise seems to become very much machinic and controlled. So I completely understand that to an engineer, it's a point of pride if they can make your game, your video conference lag less, sound less bad, look less bad, etc. And we've had some incremental improvements, and we've had some really distinctive jumps in the resolution of audio and video that we can share over the internet in an asynchronous way with downloads, or even in a synchronized way in immersive environments. You know, I'm not necessarily speaking against that at all. I'm old enough to remember that it took several hours to download one image online from the Grotte Chauvet, which is a prehistoric cave in France, where somebody was allowed to take high-resolution pictures. I would never get access to that cave, so I was very interested in that kind of cave painting. The only source at that time was that I would connect my laptop to the telephone network, paying a toll by the minute. I can still hear, but I won't imitate for you because it's kind of irritating, the sounds of the modem, and I can still feel the anxiety at the time that takes because it increases the cost of every file. Today, we would just laugh at that and we just call it up on some website or FTP servers. And I encourage you to do that. They're beautiful images if you look up the Grotte Chauvet, some of the earliest cave paintings that humans have left, and unmolested for a long time because they were inaccessible. And that kind of spelunking, that kind of exploring caves actually is not by accident, but in an interesting connection, one of the origin myths of the internet and one of the origin myths of computer gaming online in particular. Does everybody know that story? There was a couple of scientists. She was a geologist, and he was a computer scientist. He was on the BBN team that helped program the software for these early routers, the interface messaging processor that BBN as a consultant provided to the US government. And she was in the business of exploring mammoth system of caves in Kentucky. And they got divorced. And he had already started to map what she had found on his computer. And after the divorce, not only did he miss going on these spelunking explorations of a cave, but he decided he was going to take that map of one of the largest system of caves in the United States and essentially turned it into one of the earliest adventure games, called Adventure originally. And some people at Stanford started playing it and turned it into something more elaborate, etc. So this idea that when we go on the internet, we're exploring unexpected, unpredictable connections. We're following possible turns. You're always making a decision, left or right, pick this up or no. It has a lot to do with that kind of unpredictability, that contingency. You're not on rails. And a lot of computer gamers value that sense when they're playing a game, even if it's not, strictly speaking, an adventure game, that your game is not always taking you in the same direction. And a lot of us, probably when we explore culture in general, value that it's going to take us into unpredictable directions, and that we have a sense of agency where we can decide, I'm going to get more of this, no, I'm going to turn more in this direction, rather than being fed a unidirectional, monotone of sort of censored or sanitized content, such as you get from the the evening news in an authoritarian country, which is always good news about the progress in this country and shame on all the other countries. So that kind of human appetite for complexity, unpredictability, contingency, I think values the error, the potential for error, for glitch, for mistakes, much more highly than we often realize. So I've been singing that song for quite a long time, and I found that to be true in a number of different digital culture corners, whether it's gaming or whether it's internet policy, such as here about the issue of net neutrality, or the very history of engineering an internet that is robust and anticipates the fact that things will go wrong, people will err around, and that's actually what's good about the internet. That's not a weakness, that's not a legacy technical problem that we could somehow solve by going to 5G. You know, there's all these promises, or that we somehow solve by taking humans entirely out of the loop. And this is going to be part of my argument that I can't make here because Unisinos is also going to end its instructions. But when we look at the Internet of Things and the promise that we will no longer have to have humans in the loop, Internet of Things will mean that, you know, my decisions are made for me. My refrigerator can contact Amazon about groceries. The light is going to be pre-programmed to maintain a certain ambience. The smart home is going to take care of me in all kinds of ways, making people more and more passive, more and more coddled, which also means more and more controlled, and you have less agency. And I guess in my old-fashioned ways, I think that that's not the aim of human communication, to have no agency, that I'm being force-fed certain content, that I'm being maintained in some kind of homeostasis of just enough information to keep me awake, but not too much to make me unhappy with corporate or political circumstances. I think the internet promised to be something that could be explicitly political, explicitly educational, explicitly informational, in ways that we have not realized fully, and in ways that we're actually in danger of losing. So I see there's actually a little bit of a retreat from the early idealism. There are a couple of decades of idealistic build-out, and now there's been a couple of decades of privatization that seem to shut down progressively the potential of the internet, which relies entirely on the potential of error, of mistakes, of miscommunication, which then invites a rejoinder, or of disagreements, which then invites a rejoinder, which invites a correction, invites a conversation. People are much happier to be in a dialogue than to be, on couch lock, consuming YouTube on autoplay.
O que eu queria colocar ou perguntar, assim, talvez tenha mais a ver com as outras aulas, mas, enfim, em função de inúmeras reflexões sobre os temas que têm surgido, assim. Acho que foi na primeira aula que tu colocou alguma coisa sobre criptografia e colocou, prefere que vá para o governo ou para uma corporação? E essa ideia, assim, parece que, pelo menos para mim, ela vem continuando porque a gente tem, parece que um pouco dessa disputa, assim, entre um governo que regule as coisas e daí a gente acaba deixando de lado um pouco da liberdade, ou uma corporação que tem alguns interesses, então a nossa liberdade pareceria maior, mas não chegaria até lá ou algo muito maior. Tu teria, nas tuas reflexões, em teus estudos sobre isso, alguma alternativa a essa dicotomia, essa disputa que existe entre governo e corporações?
That's difficult to answer without sounding like I'm waffling. I'm equivocating. we can imagine a number of situations where the government can legitimately say, this is something for the corporate actor to fix. And we do not need regulation. We just want the, competition or whatever else in the economic field to regulate this. And we can see another range of phenomena where that is clearly insufficient, where it's not, because it's not happening. Companies don't like to self-regulate, or they shirk responsibility entirely, in which case the only possible source of correction of such errors is going to be coming from the government. So we could argue it both ways. The problem, as I said the other day already, is that companies are now operating across borders in different legal territories at the same time, and they might have a technical home base in one particular country for tax reasons, often not for other reasons. They're not really bound by the rules and laws of that country, nor can they necessarily be often bound by the laws of other countries in which they operate. So each country is free to pass certain regulations and rules, but it's very questionable whether that will take when you're dealing with Google or Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever else you might think of in terms of multi-national or global presence. I should use non-American names here as well. We can think of Russian or Chinese platforms just as easily. Or of course, Nintendo and Sony, which are ostensibly Japanese, although they're multinationals. Technical infrastructure and software, hardware and software, are difficult to regulate on a case-by-case basis. But I think to the extent that we forget the early history of the internet, we most readily seem to forget that the early internet, until the privatization of the backbone, was heavily subsidized by the United States government. So, I'm kind of appearing in front of you as an American, representing American ideas about the internet, and that has been exported around the globe. And there is still a lot, not all of these multinationals, but still a lot of them that seem to be dominating the conversation now tend to be American brands, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., being very influential in things that happen in India or happen in China or happen elsewhere, which is why some of those countries are pushing back against that. And we touched on that as well. You can totally understand why countries will say, we must push back. But on the other hand, what we get as a result is something that people call not the internet, but the splinter net. Right? So you have the splinter net because China has a firewall, the Great Firewall of China, and is trying to boost its domestic competition to multinational companies, but is also capable of censoring access. Except for a few elite universities, it's very difficult for our counterparts, for instance, to access any Google services because they're boosting their own homegrown services. We get the splinternet because countries like Russia or India, as I talked about earlier today, are capable of censoring or even shutting down their internet. That can legitimately look to the citizens in that country like a defensive action against the bad sides of the internet, or it can look to international observers like an illegitimate interference with our right, our human right, our universal right to access to information, to internet access, etc. So the problem is that neither legislation, which tends to lag behind technology, nor regulation as it's enacted in the competition between companies seems to be effective at addressing the biggest problems with digital culture, which is why it's very frustrating. But on the upside, I'm neither a political scientist nor a legal scholar or a constitutional scholar. I'm simply a media historian. So I tend to take a step back and observe from a historical distance and say, these are the things that have led to the most beneficial aspects. And here are some things that mitigate or diminish or take away those beneficial aspects. And maybe as global internet culture, we can learn from that. And I hesitate to see us as individuals, especially as academics, in our privilege and our bias as somehow opposed either to all-powerful government or all-powerful corporation, because that would be a repetition of that religious logic that I invoked briefly, where you say there's like an all-powerful creator, and I can't wish for things to be different because that would be blasphemy against the government or against Google, because I'm powerless. It often seems that way in mass media, in mass media situations, that there's a placeless power somewhere, and that we are in a powerless place. I think that's an artificial divide. What we need to realize is that the structure of the internet actually is so powerful precisely because of all our participation in it. I can understand if you think that radio or television has that structure. There's a placeless. I don't know where the radio station is. I know I won't have access to the radio studio. I will not get on Brazilian television. The only thing I can do is passively receive it. I don't get to talk back. I don't get to fast forward or whatever, time shift it. So that with older media, we do have that opposition of a placeless power and my powerless place. But the whole idea of the internet is that it's only our participation, our willing participation in Google and Facebook, etc., that makes them so powerful. And if we were to withdraw from that, that actually withdraws the basis for their profitability and their power, right? So a Google search is going to give you certain results, but you shouldn't believe that somehow Google in Mountain View, California knows anything. They only give you the most likely results to please you based on what other people have done. It's not at all that I'm accessing some wise repository of knowledge when I search on Google. It simply reinforces the most popular path. And very few people realize that in the choice of their search engine, they're actually making a political decision. Right? So I tend to recommend DuckDuckGo instead, which is a search engine that does not data mine the hell out of me. But often people make fun of me because I will get what looks like less useful results, because they're much more likely to be less tailored to me, much more likely to be demographically and otherwise diverse. But as I said before, in response to Gustavo, I tend to celebrate that. I tend to celebrate the unexpected, something that doesn't necessarily cater to me and spoon feed me things that advertisers and marketers have realized that I like. And I don't necessarily need to look to the government or the corporation to help me with the smallest little disagreements still between my expectation and their service. I actually think we should turn up dissonance, right? In terms of the three models that I offered earlier of, my approach to media would be, more dissent, more disagreement, more debate would be a healthy thing, because the opposite, I think we're close to a point where we do not turn to the internet anymore for any kind of political or aesthetic or academic debate. We just avoid people's channels who disagree with us, and increasingly, you subscribe as if you're subscribing to a subset of academic journals only, or you're only watching one type of TV news. That's an impoverished media situation. I think we should all encourage each other and our students and our colleagues and our neighbors to be more diverse in our sources of information, as long as we do have access, as long as that access is not being curtailed and censored and monotonous. because that way you have a sense of agency. Maybe you have a sense of being confused or overwhelmed, but you also get to decide, do I take this path or that path? And then you live with the consequences, and you can also backtrack and say, I made that decision a while ago. I need to replay this level. I need to retrace this map. I need to figure out where I was led to believe that this is going to be the thing I was wanted to read. Maybe now, under conditions of quasi lockdown and quarantine, we'll all spend a lot more time on the internet, and we can think about how that can serve not just our preference for comfort and for easy trade-offs, for convenience, but how we can make that a little bit more challenging and actually try to get better at the internet, right? So every day you tackle something slightly more out of your normal pattern of consumption, and instead of turning in place, you can actually go places. Even if it takes you to the end of the internet, era 404.
I do have comments from the chat room. I dreamed of using that sentence. Comments from the chat room, something 1999 or something. I'll read it in Portuguese, so get ready for the translation. Eu vou ler um comentário aqui do chat. Tem muitos alunos nossos que estavam fazendo aqui o curso, estão assistindo de casa. A Juliana está fazendo o seguinte comentário. Fiquei pensando sobre essa promessa de sair do loop de decisões, de, entre aspas, evitar erros, de ser, entre aspas, instantâneo, também não acaba resultando numa sensação de fim do mundo. Se a gente está se acostumando com essa promessa de lidar com menos erros, mais velocidade das máquinas, etc., faria com que um vírus pareça o fim. Aqui eu creio que ela se refira ao nosso novo convidado mundial. Ou que, da mesma forma, políticos que não têm medo da vergonha, como comentado mais cedo, por exemplo, também parecerem um pouco o fim do mundo democrático. Se teria alguma relação de ideia de perfeição do instantâneo com uma certa sensação de que não temos mais como lidar com problemas, de como resolver erros. A Camila também comenta, fico pensando se essa relação do instantâneo não flerta com a efemeridade dos meios de informação, dado o volume que temos, que usamos, que descartamos e do que desaparece. Como lidar com essa efemeridade e o erro. And I'll just add one comment of mine about how, it's a more academic question, I would say like that. How do you see this agenda research regarding this kind of perspective? The error, the glitch, the alternative. Can we affirm that it's been like we had the digital turn a couple of decades ago in terms of interest research, but more specifically, these topics with this approach have been flirting with media ecological perspectives, materialism perspectives, and others. How do you see this this research agenda in terms of academics?
That's a very interesting but difficult question. My inclination is to try to explain some of the stakes with music as a particular example, because I have never found anybody who doesn't like any kind of music. So I can always talk to people about music, even if we like different kinds of music, or especially if we like different kinds of music. I already made the joke about Jimi Hendrix controlling feedback for aesthetic effect. There are many other situations where it may sound as if I'm against technical progress when I say that certain things are being closed down and impoverished. We're constantly being promised technical progress, right? The CD came announced as perfect sound forever. They're not forever, and they're not perfect. That doesn't mean that I will try to celebrate in a media archaeological mode the LP or a tape, although they do have certain advantages over impoverished, cold, badly digitized sound. But any kind of music listener, even if they don't practice any music play themselves, is able to appreciate that there are differences here, and that different media, a different medium specific kind of platform has certain characteristics, has certain attributes. And some of the attributes of internet culture are wildly positive and have succeeded beyond our expectations. But there are also some aspects of digital culture that we see on the internet in general and in certain corners of the internet in particular, where a similar kind of trade-off is at work, right? As if you say, well, the LP that scratches and warps and so on is obsolete because we now have CDs and they're not being touched, therefore they can't scratch, and they are resilient against heat and use fingerprints and whatever. Because they're being read optically, so they're going to be perfect sound forever. Well, it turns out people have found out the hard way that neither forever nor perfect, and have returned to collecting vinyl or to playing magnetic tapes, or now, of course, we're being offered many different tiers of streaming qualities of music. And again, I find it easier to illustrate the trade-offs between convenience, price and speed and other forms of convenience, mobile consumption, etc., and quality, right? So the quality of experience is impoverished. If I try to listen to, some MBP, song on my phone, the phone speaker is not stereo, and the file resolution is not perfect, etc. And that already serves as a readily illustration to similar kind of access limitations. There are certain format questions that have political and aesthetic consequences, right? And if the internet promised kind of an internationalist, pacifist, global improvement of understanding along the lines of some of the forerunners, precursors to the internet. I mentioned Paul Audeley last week as a librarian from the era of the First World War. You can also mention H.G. Wells and the idea of a world brain, which is even older, more than 100 years ago. He wrote about connecting people in such a way that will reduce the necessity for violent or diplomatic disagreements, and increase the possibility of collaboration, of communication, etc. And all of those positive expectations of the internet are now apparently made obsolete with all of our worries about, we're constantly being sold fear of cyber terrorism, of hackers stealing our credit cards, of political manipulation, etc. And nonetheless, even though some of that is true, I would still rather have an internet that's somewhat insecure and allows some of these, rather than a company town where there's been a perfect lockdown, where nobody can steal anything because I don't have anything anymore that's worth stealing online, because everything is sort of predicated by a corporate or governmental overlord. So there are trade-offs, right? And as I said, my most ready trade-offs are when we think about the aesthetic experience that is music. We could argue over whether or not music should even be online, or whether that's a legitimate place for music. But now that musicians cannot, and forgive me if I go off on a tangent, but I'll come back to a point, to the first question that you read out loud. Now that musicians cannot easily perform live anymore, and many musicians are freelancers, and they're deprived from their source of income, but also from their choice of lifestyle, I see many of them play for free online. They're taken to Instagram in particular by themselves instead of playing with others, or in some cases, if they can afford it, in a hall, but without the audience physically present. So it turns out it's more than possible to use Instagram, for instance, which was never planned to be a concert hall, as a virtual. And I celebrate that. I celebrate the unexpected and unforeseen potential of the internet to communicate things that we probably I wouldn't have thought of Instagram as a place where musicians can still perform and still connect with their fans and their colleagues. And we'll see other such forms of exploring, spelunking, finding unforeseen freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, even and especially when there's a paucity of options of that, when the options are foreclosed. But it would be great, of course, if everybody could have a perfect audio-visual studio at home, and we could also receive that in high fidelity, etc. But we even in the science fiction films that predicted that we would have such things. I don't know if any of you remember the original Blade Runner film, where you have video conferencing, decades before it was economically and technically feasible for us. Now that we have that, are we using it in any interesting ways? It's become the even more deadly, boring version of a meeting, of a corporate meeting that most of us want to avoid. Perhaps there's a chance in this virus-induced social distancing that will let people invent ways of making that interesting and of making that not an imposed, pacifying kind of emergency, state of emergency that may or may not last for a long time, but to find new creative and unpredictable outlets. And I think that's basically the only answer one can give. I'm not a futurologist, but to that question, I do think that that's where the reservoir of creativity and of political and aesthetic expression is, precisely in those areas where you least expect it, not in areas where they seem to be conducive to it. We've seen politicians try to hold virtual town halls, and they're usually not very successful. We've seen politicians for a while, from J.F. Kennedy to Donald Trump, use television very effectively and also Twitter very effectively. But there must be other less controlled, less one-to-many types of communication that allow a many-to-many conversation on the internet, allow us to draw on the strength of the internet compared to other media, rather than try to turn the internet into a more controlled version of old media, right? If we were to see the internet basically turn into what corporate-dominated radio stations now do, I think we would lose not only the technical potential, but we'd also lose aesthetic and political potential of the new medium. And it might be comfortable because we understand how radio works, and it doesn't require anything of you other than turn it on or turn it off. But I do think that media literacy and requires of us that we engage more and that we make more of our own choices. And I'm not saying to you what those choices should be. In fact, I would be happiest if we all had our own exit from this room instead of all going through the same exit, or entrance for that matter. If we all had our own approaches to things. And I don't expect anybody else to go through the RFC, for that matter, to try to tell the history of the internet. I just found it a convenient repository of documents because it gives us some version control and because it celebrates the presence of error rather than try to eradicate it. Even though these are the engineers whose business it is to make the internet robust enough to deal with error, they don't say we're going to engineer it to the point where errors are no longer possible. They in fact engineer it in such a way that errors are always possible and even anticipated, and even become potential new offspins into a new direction, an unexpected cultural layer of the internet. So that's basically what I would what I would hope is the direction for a research agenda for new avenues to explore. And we see that in cultural industries that make heavy use of the internet. We see that in advertising. Advertising has had to change a lot, both technically and culturally. We see that in video gaming. Video games have changed a lot, both technically and culturally, in adaptation to new capabilities of the internet. We see that in the adaptation of music and television to the realities of internet distribution. It's really fundamentally changed the industries, not just in how they sell, but what they sell, when they sell, what they produce, right? Shorter forms, right? Rather than 3-hour movies. Now, there's still people make 3-hour movies. They're also distributed on the internet, but there's been an increasing emphasis on shorter and shorter videos. It's changed the way that musicians not only perform but write their music. We no longer think of an album necessarily, but maybe of playlists. We no longer necessarily think that playlists must be as curated by humans as they were before, but they're often curated by algorithms. There's a way that can be that can become really impoverished, and everything sounds like the same because some algorithms are just looking for something that was like the other song, which is why we still have humans spinning records in the good bars. But don't go to bars anymore. Just listen to it at home. And there's at least the potential for turning up, for increasing the unpredictability, for increasing the diversity of expression in ways that will teach all of us new things. And that's the definition of life. Rather than Foucault's definition that life is what is capable of error, which I think is a very sad humanism, I would rather say that life is what's capable of new experiences rather than repetition. And again, that's also perhaps an artificial opposition, and Hitlerians in the room might object. They say, machines are only repetition and humans are only the new. That would be probably an exaggeration that doesn't stand. But I would rather capitalize on our human capacity than on the similarity between us and machines.
That's a great way of ending this call to creativity and evolving. I do have one more comment here from Roberta. Se der tempo, gostaria de ouvir um comentário do Peter sobre como ele vê essa característica da internet de deterioração, descarte constante das coisas que dão erro. Até mesmo pela lógica capitalista e mercadológica de descarte. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, há um volume de pesquisas sobre essa desobediência da rede, onde a promessa seria uma falsa capacidade de eterno armazenamento. E, muitas vezes, nos deparamos com o erro 404, como ele falou. It's more a comment.
I think that's era 315. You're making a request that's too large. We only have 3 minutes in this room remaining because I think at 5 we're supposed to be out of here. So I'm happy to take questions on my email account or in any other format that people want to be in touch with me. And I may be able to record the last few things that I wanted to say to the class remotely, and maybe we can communicate remotely from now on, because I'm grateful to those of you who showed up here in person today, but increasingly I think the sign of the times is asynchronous distance communication of the sort that the internet enables very well. Thank you.
Antes da gente encerrar aqui, eu quero reforçar um ponto em função da gente ter encerrado mais cedo o número de encontros. Conversei com o Peter hoje de manhã e assim que ele retornar, enfim, as coisas estiverem melhor resolvidas, porque também lá na universidade dele as demandas se alteraram, que a gente vai ter esse conteúdo do Future of Internet Communities, que é o último tópico, que seria na quarta-feira, provavelmente em vídeo, né, para a gente poder também assistir aqui e, eventualmente, fazer algum tipo de encontro remoto para conversar um pouco mais com o Peter, que já vem se tornando um parceiro aqui do programa nos últimos tempos. Todos os materiais que o Peter trabalhou, no caso dos slides e algumas recomendações bibliográficas, eu estou disponibilizando para os alunos, mas também para os amigos e colegas que estão vindo aqui ou estão assistindo e que não estão matriculados especificamente, podem entrar em contato, que eu também encaminho. Eu gostaria, então, de agradecer muito a presença de todos vocês que estão aqui, que estiveram nos outros encontros e dos que estão nos assistindo agora. Quero também agradecer à equipe da Tradusul pela todo o empenho aí nesses últimos dias e a parceria e a compreensão, porque muito antes do corona, né, a gente já estava lidando com questões de prazo e algumas dificuldades de retorno em função aí das logísticas que fazem parte um pouco do trabalho com a pós-graduação no Brasil. Quero também agradecer a própria Unicinos, né, por ter disponibilizado a possibilidade da gente trabalhar dentro do projeto Print com a vinda do Peter. E esse projeto também tem, né, o apoio da CAPES. E também, por fim, gostaria de agradecer muito ao Peter, mais uma vez. So, Peter, thank you very much for helping us here, for being with us, for being such a very comprehensive guy regarding Brazilian aspects and global aspects regarding what are we dealing with right now. And I hope somehow Unicinos also, throughout our faculty and students, can make a difference in your life, in your career, and somehow I think we are step by step building this approach, and hopefully other faculty members and students were able to inter-exchange with this perspective that we are trying to build here on our grad program. And it's good to see that there is room for improvement, and if there's a country that has learned to be creative with error, that country is Brazil. So hopefully we'll get there somehow. So thanks very much once again.